I'm so happy to be here again with Dr. Michael Clarage, who has a PhD from Brandeis University and is currently working in cosmology, I guess I would say, um, and astrophysics. And Dr. Clarage was with me one other time, and we did a much more thorough introduction at that time. So you can always check in the description below for a longer introduction to his work. But today we are going to tackle a couple of things about the electric universe, and then we're going to talk maybe a little bit more philosophically. So, Michael, you were involved in the Safire Project, and that's a part of the electric universe work. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what the Safire Project is and your involvement with it. And then out of that has come an enterprise called Orion Limited, which is an energy company. And I'd love to have you talk about the implications of what they are doing and maybe the practical applications as well.
Sure. Yeah, great to be back.
Good to have you.
Yeah, Sapphire. So the electric universe. Did we talk at all last time about what the electric universe community even studies, or should I?
You went into some basics about the filaments and the electrical electrical energy that impacts the sun and how the sun is connected to various planets and so
Nice.
forth.
Okay. Yeah. So the Safire Project started as an attempt to see if it's possible to verify any of that in the laboratory. Not much cosmology or astrophysics has been verified in the laboratory. It's really hard to, you can't just make a planet in your lab, and you can't make a star in your lab. So of all the sciences, the cosmology and the astrophysics are pretty theoretical. And so the challenge was, is there anything we can do in the laboratory which will, give evidence that the sun is electrical, or even give the opposite, give evidence that no, electricity plays no part in it. And this was started back in like 2012, 2011 or so. And 2012, 2013, I had just started to be involved with the Electric Universe conferences and getting to know the scientists involved. And I was really interested in doing stuff. And so I kind of hounded the people until they let me, in their come play in their sandbox. And I was very lucky to be chosen amongst as part of the team for the Safire Project. And we spent a year and a half just trying to decide on what kind of experiments one could do. And so again, just to remind you, the idea is that in the electric universe paradigm is that stars are electrical. So when you look up at that sun, you are looking at an electrical discharge. It sounds reasonable to ordinary people. Astrophysicists go bonkers, literally going crazy if you propose such a thing. And we built the chamber. We did several years of experiments on that. There's a few, so how do I put this? The standard model of the sun is that the sun is nuclear. That in the center of the sun, there's nuclear fusion going on, where hydrogen is being fused into helium in the center of the sun. And then that is the origin of all the energy. All the energy comes from that in the standard model. And if there's any electricity involved, it's just a meaningless byproduct. And the electric universe paradigm flips that entirely and says, no, really, it's just like an electric light bulb, the surface of the sun. There are so many features of the sun that are not explained by the standard model of the sun. That was something that was kind of a shock for me, because I'm a trained astrophysicist, and I was like, well, how come no one ever talked about all the things that are not explained? So something as simple as sunspots. Sunspots are very strange things. Those are those dark spots that show up on the sun's surface. And the more you learn about them, they're just very peculiar structures. And there's nothing if you try to model the sun as a nuclear fusion going on inside of a giant gas ball, there's nothing that you don't derive that you would expect sunspots to exist. Just you don't get that out of the model. So what we would do is say, well, can we create sunspots electrically? Like if we light up a ball in our laboratory, will it spontaneously develop sunspots? That would be the sort of thing one could check in the laboratory. There's other things that I'll just focus on the things we were able to replicate. One of the things that's not explainable with the standard model is the temperature profile of the atmosphere as you move away from the sun. As you move away from the sun, the temperature of the atmosphere gets hotter. Makes no sense. I mean, imagine a campfire or any source of heat, on Earth here. And as you move away from it, the temperature goes up. Right? That is just strange from a physicist's point of view. And so we were able to replicate that feature. So in some of our experiments, we have our electric sun in the center, and we're measuring the temperature of the atmosphere as you move away from it. And we're measuring it the same way that NASA measures the temperature of our star. And we were able to replicate that, not the exact temperature profile, but we were able to see that as we move our probes away from our electric sun, the temperature of the atmosphere would increase. So that was a huge win, actually. I mean, that's an enormous amount of a very strong piece of evidence in favor of there being electricity involved with the sun. You may have also seen in some of the pictures of the sun, there's these solar flares, these blobs of material that go shooting off the sun. Mm-hmm. Solar flares, solar eruptions. Again, there's not much in the standard model that would say those would be happening. We were able to see those in our work. There was a third one I was going to tell you about. I'm just skipping my mind right now. It'll come eventually. And then in the course of doing this, as we're looking at our experimental apparatus, again, our minds are just thinking about the electric sun. We start to realize that the materials in the chamber, there's something strange about the materials in the chamber. Like we're seeing material in the chamber that we didn't start with. So we'll have a center star that is made of metal because it's easier to make an electric discharge with metal. So we'll have a piece of metal in the sun as the sun, piece of iron in the middle there. We run our experiment, and then we start looking at our piece of iron. And on the piece of iron, we're seeing calcium and potassium and aluminum and titanium. And what else do we see? Barium, lanthanum, cerium. And we're just like, where did these come from, right? We know what we put in there. And so we kind of just stored it in the back of our minds for a while as a strange thing. And then as our experiments were winding down and we're thinking, well, what can we do to make a company out of this? Because the very generous, there was a well-to-do family funded the entire research. And so we got to be one of the few privately funded astronomy projects in existence on the planet. Because these days, if you want to do astronomy, either you're in your backyard or you're working at a university or for NASA. That's it. Those are the only options, right? So the funding was done. Okay, we completed our astronomy project. If we were going to do something else, it might require an enormous amount of money. And so it was on us then. How do we continue? And through talking with various people, the idea came up. Well, if we can, it's called transmutation. You transmute one element into another. If we can transmute iron into aluminum, titanium, calcium, and potassium, maybe we could transmute radioactive elements into something that's not radioactive. That was about 2 years ago. And so Orion Energy was started with that in mind. And I learned a lot about radioactive waste in the last 2 years. Like a lot of things, it's really depressing the more you learn. If you listen to the nuclear power industry, they're like, no problem, nothing to see here, right? Just move on. We got this covered. And they do not have it covered, right? They have no idea what to do with this stuff. But we didn't actually want to go that route because those people are so powerful. Nuclear power, the Department of Defense, the nuclear regulatory agencies, they don't want anybody in their sandbox. I was a little surprised by that because we talked to several different of these agencies in several different countries, and you could tell they were like, no thanks, bye, we'll call you. And so we were able to then, through various other routes, to hit upon fracking water. So fracking water is radioactive. I didn't know that. Because under the surface of the earth, radioactivity is natural. It's really cool. We understand so little of what's going on under our feet. Radioactivity is natural under like about 1,000 feet under the ground, 2,000 feet under the ground, etc. On the surface, no, not so much. Nature doesn't do radioactive on the surface for whatever reason. I mean, it's little bits, but under the ground there is. And so when the oil industry shoots their water into the oil well to break open the earth and destroy everyone's water supply, and then the oil and gas come shooting up out of, from all that pressurized water that you shot into the oil well, the water that comes up is radioactive. It's carrying with it radium and iodine, and depends upon where on the earth you are. And what do the oil companies do with that water? Oh, they just spray it all over the ground because they have no idea what to do with it. So, so that's where we're focused. That is where we are focused, is raising money to create a prototype to neutralize the radioactivity of fracking water.
Wow. But that's not something that you could do with the electric sun, is it? Is that a completely different process then?
Well, we don't think so. But this is why it's a research project, and this is why we're raising money to do it, because we don't have the answer to that yet. Mm-hmm. But we think it is. We think that so one of the things that I've learned in researching all this for the last 10 years or so is that changing elements into each other is a natural process. Nature is doing it all the time. There was a wonderful researcher, Louis Kervran. He was a French researcher, and he stumbled on it because in the 1950s, the French government had oil wells in Algiers, which is in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and the workers weren't dying in the heat. And the oil company was like, this doesn't make sense. It's 120 degrees. The guys are working 10-hour days in the sun. They should be dying. So that was the origin of that. So they sent down Kervran to figure out what's going on. And he showed simply by giving them only water that had sodium in it and not giving them any calcium or potassium. I kind of forget now which it was. Not giving them any potassium. And then he would measure their sweat and their urine, and he would find all kinds of potassium in their sweat and in their urine, even though he wasn't feeding them any, right? And so that was the beginning of his research. And then he researched a lot of different organisms, daisies and various plants, animals. It's chickens. This is something that biology knows how to do. Biological systems know how to transmute elements into each other. Sorry, I didn't give a punchline for the oil worker one. That reaction of transmuting calcium into potassium is endothermic. It absorbs a lot of energy, a lot of heat. So the bodies of the oil workers were taking their excess body heat and using it to create potassium out of calcium, was his conclusion. Yeah, wow. Wow is right.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And that's how they didn't die in the heat of heat exhaustion. So why did I bring that up? Okay, so this idea, so nature does this. Nature transmutes elements into other elements. If you're a scientist educated currently, you are taught that transmutation of elements only occurs inside of stars and inside of nuclear bombs. And nuclear power plants. That's it. I don't know why humans always do this, right? We learn 3 things and then we say everything is only these 3 things, nothing else, right? And this was a classic example, but transmutation is happening inside the earth. It's happening in biological systems. It's happening in lightning strikes. It's happening outside in the cosmos. It's really a natural process. And so we're kind of going on that understanding to say, I'll bet you $50 million that we can, in 3 years, we can create a prototype that will neutralize the radioactivity of fracking water. It'll take the radioactive radium and we'll turn it into other stuff, probably lead, but we'll see. We'll see what we turn it into.
That would certainly be great. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so one of the other things that I read on the Orion website is that since lanthanum and cerium were both things that were turning up on inside the chamber, and that they're very rare metals, that it might be possible to produce those rather than having to mine them from the deep earth mining kind of thing.
Exactly. And it's a very speculative possibility. With going on almost no data, I kind of feel that it would take enormous amounts of energy and raw materials to make cerium and lanthanum and neodymium and all those things. But that's kind of a guess on my part. Other people on the team feel differently. Other people on the team are like, no, I mean, this is going to be a natural byproduct of our process, is these rare earth elements.
Oh, so in the process of transmuting the radioactive water, you might get the natural byproduct of the rare elements.
Right. It's
that
very
would be almost too perfect, wouldn't it?
It would be. It would be very good. It'd be very good. I know what we're going to find. So if you can kind of put yourself back into the mindset of a scientist like in 1720 or something, chemistry, what we now call chemistry, was a young science, and people didn't really know the rules. They were just, making these measurements and these experiments, trying to understand the vocabulary. And then over time, what happens is you understand the principles of your science, and you are able to say things like, oh, you want to, let's think of a chemical reaction that we use all the time. You want to make a soap. You want to have something you can put into water that will lower the pH of your laundry water, and at the same time create these little, what do they call them? The little spheres of lipids that are able to digest. Emulsifier. You want to create an emulsifier that will enclose your fat. That's a chemical reaction that our chemists have worked out. Like, this is how you achieve this. If you want to lower the pH of the water, okay, your soap has to have sodium lauryl sulfate in it, yada, 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 right? But statements like that would have sounded like, just too complicated and weird in 1720. So we're at the same place now with the transmutation of elements. We don't even know the language, the vocabulary. We don't know what things to tweak. And then it may not be our generation, it might be the next generation. If we say things like, oh, we want rare earth elements, then you'll be like, the scientist in the future will be like, oh, that means you have to do X, Y, and Z. That means you need to set up this, you need to have this here, you need to start with calcium. It'll be some set of rules that you get in order to produce the rare earth elements more efficiently.
Well, the other place that I've heard about this kind of getting rid of the nuclear waste is in the Gen 4 nuclear, which is supposed to be able to use nuclear waste as its fuel. Have you heard about that?
I definitely have. And there's different versions of that. I hadn't heard of the one that you just said, but that is the idea. And when we were talking to the nuclear agencies 2 years ago, we learned about these things, right? There's all these, and those might be a good idea. I didn't really, follow through. In Canada, they are trying to roll out these small nuclear reactors, which, supposedly, according to the people selling them, run for 75 years, and then they eat up their own waste, and then they're done, and then they just kind of fizzle out. I don't know. I didn't study it enough.
Well, we should have one of those on every street corner, right?
No.
My husband is always saying, if they can power nuclear subs on nuclear with a tiny little ping pong ball of nuclear material to power these nuclear subs, why aren't we using it for everything instead of using so much carbon material?
Exactly. These are big questions. These are huge questions. And sometimes one feels very small trying to do anything about them, about these questions, because the forces are so big, right? These are gigantic, powerful organizations. And
well, yeah, I mean, you're doing battle not only with the physical forces that have all of those laws and all the complications about how to make one thing work and how to make something into another thing, but then you're also doing battle with all these agencies. And so that brings up a question that you wanted to discuss, which was, well, why don't you read the question that you sent me on the email?
yes, so this was just so people can Karen had an interview, it was a few months ago. I actually don't remember when it was, two people on, and there was the question came up about evil. I forget what led to it, but my ears peaked up, and Karen, you asked something, and there was some response, and then Karen said something like, well, you two, she was talking to the people she was interviewing, are referring to evil outside in the world. Evil in the world, is there evil in the world? You know, because maybe it's just stupidity. Maybe maybe there's not evil. Maybe there's just rampant stupidity or something like that. And then you said something like, well, okay, maybe there's evil outside of us, or maybe not. But what we really need to do is ask that question about ourselves individually. Do I have any responsibility in the evil of the world? Do I have any evil in myself? And the reason I remember the question was because the two gentlemen who had no trouble talking about a host of other topics just became dead silent at that point in the interview. And I was like, oh, I would love to discuss that with Karen, because I think that's an incredibly important point. And I wonder if it was even because they were scientists, and something, I don't know how it happened. Something happened where scientists, we were somehow told to keep our noses out of politics and keep our noses out of questions of morality and keep our noses out of, the idea of good and evil. Just don't. And what a stupid notion, that anyone, let alone a scientist, would abrogate their responsibility for such fundamental questions. I guess, part of the cheap sell, there's always these lies that get used to sell ideas. But the lie, I think, had something to do with, well, as a scientist, you're objective and you're just dealing with the laws of nature, and the laws of nature, have no morality in them. So you just focus on your test tubes, right? I think that was the argument, as stupid as it sounds when I say it with that tone of voice. But yeah, so I've been pondering it a lot for the last 2 years, because I think, like a lot of people, I've seen some large collectivist movements happen across the world in very specific ways. A lot of handing over one's responsibility to agencies, federal agencies, to the government, etc. A lot of doctors in the last 2 years handed over their responsibility to these 3-letter agencies and just said, just tell me how to treat my patient. You just tell me how I treat my patient, and then that's what I'll do. And other doctors, especially older doctors, are like, wait a minute, whoa, that is not how this works, right? The people, the individuals who are dealing with patients, they are the ones who decide how to treat. And then over time, best practices can be codified by the agencies, et cetera. And I certainly felt sometimes that so it's a question whether there's any evil in that. Like, is there any evil in the government trying to take over everything we do, right? Or is it just the mindless, stupid progress of bureaucrats, right? And so when one asks these questions, one is invariably brought to the world stage, in the early 20th century, first half of the 20th century, when these very large socio-political organizations just grew up on the earth, communism growing up, whoosh, covering all of Russia and China, and various totalitarian movements. And I'm sure they happened sometime in the past, because I don't think, I think things repeat, right? But we don't really have an example in our most of our history of this. And what is the individual's responsibility in that? Because most of those movements, from one point of view, have to do with the individual giving up their responsibility. Like they become a member of the state. You just tell me what to do, Mr. Government. You tell me what to do. I will be a function of you. I will be a function of my government. And I felt something similar happening the last 2 years. And there's the thought that, well, if we could just get rid of those stupid government people, then everything would be okay, and then we'd all treat each other well, and we'd all get along in our little neighborhoods, right? I watched myself kind of go through that simple argument. Well, if we can just eliminate those idiots, in Washington or whatever, in the Kremlin, we can just eliminate them, then people will just treat each other nice, we'll live and let live, and everything will be okay. And something in me was like, well, I don't, that argument assumes that I don't have the same tendencies in me, that I would not try to dominate Karen Wong, right? I'm assuming that I would never do that. And as some of the great spiritual teachers have taught us over the ages, no, you have the same, we all have the same tendencies. We all have greed in us. We all have pride. We all have avarice. These are universal.
I think that's exactly the thing that the materialists don't want to talk about, because, and I've thought about this for probably 30 years, maybe, that sin, which is the evil in me, actually, I mean, if you wind sin all the way back to the garden, it comes down to not trusting God, or thinking that I can do things better than God, or that that my answer is better, or that I can find my own way by myself. I'll listen to somebody else rather than listening to God. It all comes down to that. That's the basic thing. But what that turns into in me is then I know better for everybody else what they should be doing. So then that, right, that turns into evil in me. And that in itself, if all we had to look at in the world was the existence of sin, that you could prove the existence of God and the need for God and the need for salvation and everything just out of that one thing. And so I think that's exactly why the materialists never want to go there. It's way easier for them to point at something else and say all the evil is out there. Just like, back when I first became a Christian, that was about the time that Iran was having the revolution and everything. And they'd have people out marching in the streets, take down the great Satan America,
Yeah.
And that was because the leaders of Iran were not doing a good job, and the people were hungry and they were angry and they were rioting in the streets. So you got to have an enemy, make the enemy out there someplace, so then you don't have to step up and take care of things, right? And so it's very easy to offload the evil to somebody else, so then I don't take responsibility for where I've messed up. But when you were talking about these great movements like communism and socialism and fascism and everything, you made a comment just before that about bureaucracy. And I thought, see, that's where it all started. Because I can remember, I don't remember who the writers were. Maybe Dostoevsky was one of them, maybe Kafka. Some of these guys that wrote about these mindless bureaucrats.
Yeah.
That where the government people, the people that we elect or that we appoint, or that for one reason or another have taken power, their approach to writing laws or making systems is they don't want to take responsibility for everything. So they offload it onto some agency. And then that agency sets up a bunch of bureaucrats who are reading the law, and they're the ones who are deciding what the law actually means. So if something goes wrong, the lawmaker can say, well, it wasn't me. This dumb agency over here made a mistake.
Yeah.
So then you fill the agency up with all these people who probably aren't happy in their work, and everything becomes mindless for them. Or some of them have this sin problem too, and they think, well, I can make things work the way I want them to work, or I can use my little kingdom here, my little fiefdom, to exercise my power over other people, so I can make it really difficult for you by making the laws very complicated.
Mm.
You know, there's all this stuff from the individual coming out in every one of these things. And it does turn into a larger thing because it becomes a system of all these individual sins working together. And, you know, some of the people in this little corner of the internet have tried to put a name on this thing.
Mm.
Twitter is one of those things, right? Twitter is something that has risen up out of the twisted thinking in all the individuals who are part of Twitter.
Mm.
And now it's a thing, and it has its own life, and it has its own power. And some people have tried to give it a name and call it something like an egregore.
Oh, okay.
And there, you know, you could, but it does look like an outside evil.
Yeah.
But Jordan Peterson has always said, if each individual will bear their own responsibility and determine to speak truth, no matter what the consequences are, and if more and more and more individuals do this, that thing will start to collapse because there won't be any more power behind it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a very hopeful idea. And Solzhenitsyn also, I think, is very much an advocate of that.
That's where Peterson got it, was from Solzhenitsyn.
Okay, yeah, that's how that is you don't solve the problem by violently overthrowing the system. Going and smashing Twitter servers is not is not gonna do away with the problem, but finding a way to speak the. I'm just repeating what you said. Is to speak the truth. Yeah, is as best you can. And it was Matthias Desmet who he made the connection with speak the truth as best you can, and really, when you're doing it, really focus on being gentle while you are doing it. You are not there to lecture people. You're not there to tell people that they're wrong. You are there to speak your truth. This is how I see things. And I thought that was a really useful addition to this idea of speaking the truth.
Well, that's one of the reasons I love conversations like this, is that you don't really get a chance to speak truth if you're not speaking. Right? So it's in speaking to each other that we learn how to navigate what's inside our heads and in our experience and our ideas, and find a way to communicate that to other people. And if we try to do that with the best heart that we can, then we are helping refine each other, refine each other's ideas. We're helping ourselves, even as we speak. You know, I have to be always thinking, is this really my idea, or do I need to refine it a little bit, or am I fudging a little bit because I'm trying to protect myself? And so until you're actually in the act of communicating, you never have that experience.
Yeah. I wanted to roll back. You initially were connecting, you said the materialists, and I forget exactly what, but what I wanted to make, I made a note that as a materialist, I place reality in the senses. And so if I see someone else acting in a violent or evil way, or a way that I think is wrong, I believe that the evil is outside of me, because my senses don't show me that I also have violence in me, or intolerance, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to explore that, if that's what you meant, or if you had a different idea when you said that. If you could remind me, well, I had said something and you said, oh, the materialists often are guilty of that. What were you saying?
Well, I think materialists don't want to recognize that sin exists.
That's right. That's what you were.
They will recognize wrong behavior. recognize violence and maybe even hatred, vicious language or injuring people. They will recognize that. But the minute you talk about sin, then that means sin is actually something that exists and exists in each person.
Yeah.
But if materialism is true, then where would sin come from?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
well, if materialism is true, where does love come from? Where does, charity come from? Where do any of those things come from? Because those are not material things. Now they try to explain it by saying, oh, well, chimps had this social activity with each other while they were evolving, and then that turns into love. That's a nice story, but
It's a nice story. Yeah.
yeah. And then if the idea is that we're always evolving, we're always progressing and getting better, then you're left with trying to explain why in the human race we can still be even more vicious and more violent and more treacherous and even more betraying than animals.
Yes.
Animals get vicious with each other, but not because they're betraying each other, not because they're lying in wait to do evil. But humans will do that. So I think you have to have some explanation for that.
Yeah. I like that a materialist won't admit that sin is real. I like that. That's a very powerful starting point. I was also trying to that so it was actually since you and I talked last, particularly because I've been wondering about it, but then since you and I talked about it, is like I see plenty of things I don't like about these large power structures. Pretty much every government is just doing. You can we can put on the you can censor me, but there's that great Australian phrase, empire shit fuckery. Like all these large organizations are just doing such incredibly, awful stuff. It's just the shit fuckery that's going on. And so, but since you and I talked, I was realizing that I'm allowing it. Like I am not doing everything in my power to somehow, I'm allowing people to abuse each other, to form these systems, and so like if this gets back to the idea, if you could just replace Twitter, or if you could just replace Lenin, or if you could just replace Putin or whatever, that would solve a problem. But if we flip that and we say, when I say to myself, well, why am I allowing my country to be run by these people? So, and what I was pondering over the last couple of weeks, months, is it's almost like proof that I have the same problem in myself. Like if I can allow someone else to abuse the poor, abuse the weak, that means that I have that same tendency myself. I know it's not a completely formed thought. I've been musing on it, but I think there's something to it. I think there is something to it that I don't really realize, that I have the same problems, that I would do the same thing, maybe do the same thing if I was in their position. And that's why I allow them to continue.
Well, how much of, so when you say allow, in the United States, we have the responsibility, I don't know if you would call it a power, but we have the responsibility to vote, right? We have the responsibility to try to understand as best we can how things work and who would represent us in the best way and who would do things that would be the most helpful. I think a lot of people nowadays have the feeling that, well, it's gone too far down the hole, that it doesn't really matter anymore how I vote. And this is why our voting numbers are way, way, way down. I mean, they keep talking about how they're going to require everybody to vote, but I don't see how that solves the problem, because if you're voting only because you're required to, you're still not going to do the requisite research or really try to understand how, I mean, I kind of feel like the problem goes way back to education, that we need to have education on economics and budgeting and all these kinds of things in the elementary and junior and high school. And kids graduate from high school without any knowledge of any of those things. And then they start voting. They have no idea how things are supposed to work and how money should be used, or
exactly,
what
or
costs anything, or
yep, how money works at all. Very few of us know how our current monetary system works. Yeah.
and very few people understand that when the government starts a program, that the government already has, I mean, you've seen those charts, haven't you, of all the different agencies and how, like within the Department of Education, there would be agencies that will overlap with agencies that are in the Department of Health and Human Services. And they both have budgets and they're both doing the same thing, but they're sometimes at cross purposes, but they're just money flowing everywhere. And even if everyone in all of those jobs has the best heart and is really trying to do their best, they're all being obfuscated by one thing or another that was in their own system. So money that could be spent on a local level and actually accomplish something just gets chewed up and spit out at the federal level.
Yes.
And yet people keep wanting to give more and more money to the federal government to solve the problems that they're creating, so
yeah, and that's part of, I never used to think about it that much. I used to have I think like a lot of us, an intuitive sense that the federal government is enormously wasteful, an entropy producing machine or something like that. How come our engine isn't working rightly? Well, because it's mostly producing heat, right? It's not producing movement. But again, like I was saying, that in the last couple of years and this kind of growth of these larger collectivist kind of thinking, I have learned a lot more about how the U.S. government works. I was motivated, right? And I can imagine what you just said. I didn't know what you just said. But I remember my father's a very savvy businessman, architect, civil engineer. I admire him so much for his street smarts. And I remember, from a very young boy, he would just let it slip some statements like, well, a government program is not going to solve this problem, right? This is a local problem. This is a problem, whatever, And I didn't really, but I got the feeling of it. And now I think I really kind of, the more I learn, I'm kind of like, and I don't know I'm stymied by it. Like, we really do believe that these problems are going to be solved by government action. Or now, a lot of I see it, a stronger movement to even go trans government. Like we need these world organizations. We need the World Health Organization. We need the World Economic Forum. We need the world such and I'm like, no, I don't think these problems are going to be solved but a World Health Organization, for example. But then, people come back and say, well, it is a global problem. It affects everyone. We need to have a solution at that level. And, I have a hard time logically arguing against that point of view, but I know it's wrong. I know it's the wrong answer.
So one of the things that occurred to me when the whole COVID thing started was that, in a sense, it was a perfect opportunity to find a solution, because we had 190, 185, however many countries there are, all experiencing the same problem.
Yeah.
And if each one of them used their local expertise as a nation, their local medical facilities, their local scientists, and all, and if the leaders of those countries instituted their own system of, either lockdown or no lockdown, or if they all did their own unique way, then you'd have 180 empirical experiments that you could look at and see which ones did the best.
Yes.
That's not what happened, because almost immediately everybody jumped to one model. So then there's no way to find out what's right and what's wrong and what's working and what's not working, right?
Exactly. I completely agree. Yep. And that works. The same applies down to the hospital level. Like, doctors were everyone was instructed, here's what you do. And there was really very little of people looking, okay, what do they do over here? What do they do over here? What was this treatment? How did that go? How did that go? How did that go? And then watch and shoot. No, it didn't work that way. It worked just the opposite. There was one message. You were talking about the origin of sin being this inability or decision to not listen, not follow the direction of higher power, divine power. Doesn't it strike you as odd that because we were just describing how what went wrong was there was one voice, one higher power, one message that everyone now must follow. And in the course of you and me just describing that in the last 5 minutes, we were describing it as not a good thing. That's not the way you do it. So it seems to me ironic or strange or weird or something that on Earth, when you have the one power dictating everything, it's not a good setup. And yet, in whatever the Garden of Eden represents, there was the one power that was dictating everything, and things worked, supposedly, right? So it's almost like it's the same model, but why is it go so horribly wrong in the one case, and why do we aspire to it in the other case?
Well, I mean, I don't know if that's a rhetorical question, but in the one case, the father of all, the architect of the universe, the king, the Holy One, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, ultimate goodness, truth, and beauty. You can trust that within that frame, and that God Himself is love. So we have love, and then you have goodness, truth, and beauty within that frame. I think you can trust that all decisions are for our good because He loves us. But I think even beyond that, and this is where I think I talked to you a little bit last time about this idea that I have about the principles of art and how that is very, to me, tells me a lot about how the universe is created and how the universe operates. That the way God operates is not a whole system of picky little bureaucratic rules and regimentation, but it's through these large principles, and that provides a flexibility that you don't get when you have a World Economic Forum or a World Health Organization, because they're trying to micromanage from one position 8 billion people. It's the same thing that happened in the Soviet Union when they had their centralized government, and they were trying to decide what to manufacture and how to distribute it nationally so that everybody had what they needed. They ended up manufacturing gajillions of nails that nobody needed because nobody was building anything, but there wasn't enough bread for people. So it was a misallocation of resources, which often happens when you have micromanagement from the top. But when God does things, He does through these beautiful, flexible principles and sliding scales of beauty, goodness, and truth. And it's a completely different thing. And God is also working His goodness, truth, and beauty through human beings, because it's the church, as the body of Christ, is also receiving through His Holy Spirit the instructions of how to go out and serve and love and support other people and speak the truth, and all of these things bring habitable order into being, but through this infinite flexibility, because now you have 1 billion people instead of one mind. You have 1 billion different creative ways of approaching things, and I think that's exactly where the problem comes in, because if you only have one centralized unit with their little bureaucrats, It's only going to be done one way. And that's exactly what happened in COVID.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I think and the creativity is inherent in the one case, whereas creativity is not tolerated in the other case.
Yeah.
And that gets back, relates to your statements about art, that there's something inherent. I mean, that's one of the inherent qualities of it, is the creativity.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I would wonder if there's something in us that wants, I think it clearly has bothered me and a lot of other people, like, where I work, I was just like, everybody's marching off to get their shots. And I was just like, why are you doing this? Right? Well, because I have to, because I'm told to, because we're all doing it. Drove me bonkers. I really had a hard, it affected me pretty strongly. So because it seemed like there's something in us that wants to be just a cog. Wants to be just a cog in a bigger system. We want to give over our creativity and our responsibility. We want to hand it over, and that scared me. Scared the bejesus out of me to see that happening all around me.
Well, it scares me when I see it in myself. I see it in myself because it's way easier to blame somebody else for my problems than it is to blame myself for my problem. And if I hand over my responsibility to someone else, then I can say, well, they did this to me,
I like the connection. Yeah, that's a very good connection. I just lost it, but I just had it when you answered. I'll see if I can rephrase it. That I have a hard time seeing my fault in anything, really. And I want to put that responsibility outside myself. You are the reason that I snapped and was all snitty with, it wasn't me, it was you, right? And that is right connected with with what I was just saying about how could people almost want to give over their responsibility to other people. Is that kind of what you were?
Exactly. It's the same problem as the whole victim mindset. And I think that thing has taken hold in our culture more and more and more. And like right now, it's just reigning supreme, the whole victim mentality, that it's somebody else's fault. And so people will always say, if there's a problem, they'll say, well, somebody should do something.
Right. Exactly. Right. Someone should do something about this.
Who is someone? Well, I suppose someone is the government.
Right. Which is by definition not a someone. Right. It's it's not a person. It's something else, a government, right? It's not a person.
Yeah. And that's another, I mean, materialists ought to wake up a little bit, because government is not something that you can't cut it up and put it under a microscope, and yet it's something. It's something that we all give our power to, right?
Yeah.
And we give our authority to it, and we give our financial support to it. We think about it all the time. Some people love it, some people hate it. So it's a thing.
It's a force. It has power and force in it somehow. Yeah. I gave some talks years ago on materialism, and was pointing out that for those who don't know the history of science, they almost sound like idiots when they try to make materialist arguments, because the definition of what is material keeps changing in the history of science. And the classic example being like in the 1850s, all the developments of electromagnetism and working with radio waves and whatnot. Before 1850, radio waves were not a material thing. They because you couldn't see them, you had no instrument to detect them, you couldn't manipulate them, et cetera, et cetera. And then these brilliant guys in London and Germany primarily start to develop devices where we can generate and measure radio waves, and we can send signals to each other across the city. You know, you can hit your antenna over here and my antenna over here vibrates, and we can send signals to each other. And then all of a sudden, radio waves became material. Electromagnetic waves became a material. And now it's part of the materialist paradigm. And when you study physics in school, you learn about electricity and magnetism. And there's this thing called the electric field, and there's this thing called the magnetic field, you know, and you're indoctrinated that now this is a material, this is a real thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so at any point in history, if you're standing up on your soapbox and making materialist arguments, it's almost as if you don't know the history of science, because 10 years from now, there's going to be materiality that wasn't recognized before, which will be recognized. And on the one hand, this is a level of humility that I wish was more common in my chosen field as a scientist. But on the other hand, it's a real weakness in thought. It's a real sloppiness and weakness in thinking. And, you know, there's this habit of poo-pooing and ridiculing people who want to suggest something like, oh, are you saying that love is a materiality? And I'd be like, yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying, that it is a something. It's not a nothing, right? And just because we haven't yet invented the love meter, you know, and then you're going to get up and tell me that there's no such thing. Actually, we do have a love meter. It's called our eyes. If you look at someone's eyes who's looking at someone they love, you can tell that they love that person, right? So we have the love meter already, but we haven't built it out of wires and batteries yet, right? So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So like even light, until they discovered that photons had force, which required a very sensitive measurement thing.
Yeah. Until
that point, then they just assumed that light was continuous and was not material. And then they found the photons, and okay, now it's measurable. So everything comes down to measurement. But that's also one of the arguments of the materialists, though, is that ultimately everything will be measurable. So I don't think I can follow that idea all the way to the conclusion. You know what I'm saying? That I don't want to agree that everything is measurable. Everything is quantifiable, because then that makes everything about quantity and leaves out quality.
Yeah. Now, when you say, so let me just ask then, so measurable, I'm kind of making fun of the idea that we can just keep building little instruments out of glass and metal to measure things. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, I would agree. I don't think that route is never going to measure everything, even though I think a lot of scientists believe it somehow, or engineers believe it, that if we just keep making better instruments out of glass and wire and whatnot, we'll be able to measure everything. So that route is not going to get us somewhere. But that's not the same thing, I think, that you just brought up about quantity versus quality. Are there any instruments we have as scientists that allow us to measure quality? Ooh, there's an interesting question. I'll have to think about that. Nothing occurs to me right now.
Well, I had the conversation with Wolfgang Smith about his idea of vertical causation. Okay. And since I had the conversation with him, I've read a lot more of his material. And so he has an interesting idea that science in the last several hundred years has tipped all of material reality from last time we talked about levels. They've taken all these levels and they've tipped it over 90 degrees. So now everything is horizontal. It's all on this horizontal plane. And that horizontal plane is not one of rising up to meet something higher, but of progressing towards a goal. And so we're always progressing. That's how we became progressive, right? And that this progressing is on this horizontal plane, and that's why everything can be diminished down into the quantum level. So you and I are just particles. This light on the screen is just particles. We're all just particles, and maybe we're here, maybe we're not here, maybe it's just particles. But he says the glitch in the matrix is that the only way that these particles ever become particles and not just waves, because otherwise you just have wave fields, right?
Mhm.
The way we become particles is when we're measured, when
Yeah.
particles are measured. But the
Right.
measuring instrument itself is not on the quantum level.
Mm.
The measuring instrument is up here.
Mm.
Even if the measuring instrument is made out of glass and steel, it's
Mm.
not a quantum piece of equipment.
Mm.
It's a
Yeah.
corporeal piece of equipment. So
Right.
even if the only way that things come into reality out of the wave field into a particle is just at the level of humans looking at a measuring machine, it's still a horizontal causation. I mean, it's still a vertical
A
causation.
vertical causation,
Yeah.
right?
It's not horizontal, because at the horizontal level, everything just continues, particles, 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 particles.
Yeah, I like that. So that's a good way. That's a good way to put. I wrestle with just how to explain levels in our current materialist world, and it's a very difficult thing. I think it's something that some of us get. We just get it. You get it. I get it. It's like Smith gets it. But how do you how do you explain it?
Well,
How do
I would recommend some of his books. Actually, his
Yeah.
Vertical Ascent is very good, and he's
Okay.
just written a new one. I have the PDF of it. It's called a new on physics and a new ontology. I think a
Okay.
new ontology of causation or something like that.
Yeah.
It's not very long. It's sort of a recap of his former 3 books, kind of putting them into
Okay. Cool.
focus. But it helps
Yeah.
to have read. I think it helps to read the Vertical Ascent to get the real picture of what he's doing, because
Okay. Yeah.
I think what he's doing could be transformative to society if people
Mm.
could grasp it.
Mm.
And I don't think it's really that difficult an idea, but
Mm.
what it does is it makes you turn your mind from the horizontal, just flip it back up again, and let's get
Yeah.
the levels back in there, and see that there is, I don't know if you've ever listened to Jonathan Peugeot.
Oh, I love him.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, you know how he's always talking about hierarchy, right? And,
Yes. Yeah.
have you read Matthew Peugeot's book, The Language of Creation?
I have. It's over there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Great
yeah,
little book. Great little
it
bit. That's
is.
one where he talks about Genesis, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But
He and
he
his
also
brother.
goes through bit by bit all these different principles about what space and time are, and
Yeah. No, I love.
yeah, it's a very sophisticated framework.
Yeah, and it's a very encouraging thing that a lot of people seem to know about Jonathan Peugeot. That's
Yeah,
a very encouraging thing, I
yeah,
think.
that is.
That's a good sign. That's a very good sign. I want to come back to this quality thing. Let's see if so like if I it's just something that all of us know as humans. Like you can but it's always outside the realm of, it seems to be somehow always outside the realm of what can be measured. So I might put the 2 paintings up in front of you, and you would say, oh, the one on the right there's something about that one, right? But there's nothing, we have no instruments yet, any of us, any scientific instruments. Or I might cook 2 meals, and the one meal I cook because I'm in a hurry and I don't like you anyway, and so here's some food. And the other one, it's like, oh my God, I've been waiting for months for you to come to my house, and I cook you this food. And the 2 would taste entirely different because they would have a different quality to them. But we have no instruments to measure that, and yet somehow we, as humans, like we just measure it. We just know it somehow.
Yeah, have you ever, I have a friend who has a YouTube channel called A Quality Existence, and she has spent maybe 3 years going through Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Okay.
Did you ever read that book?
I did read it long ago. Yeah.
Yeah, I never read it, but I've followed her along.
Okay.
And that whole thing is about quality. And Robert Pirsig's whole thing was that quality is what drives the universe.
Mm.
It's this always striving for quality, because when a motorcycle repair, and I'm probably going to get this wrong because I don't know this nearly as well as she does, but let's say a guy's trying to repair his motorcycle. He has an innate sense when he gets to the place where things are fitting together the way that they're supposed to fit together, so that it's going to have the right sound, it's going to have the right,
Yes.
speed,
Right.
everything is going to work
Vibration.
right. You have that quality sense in you.
Yeah.
And somehow that same quality sense is out there in the growth of a tree, or in the growth of a flower, or in a hummingbird. Michael Levin is always talking about limbs, how the right and the left arm will, the cells will talk to each other, build the arm over there, build the other arm on the opposite side, and they know when to stop because they know when the quality was reached, right?
Yeah.
So this sense of quality is built into the universe everywhere.
Yes.
And yet scientists never talk about it because they can't measure it.
Because we can't measure it. Yeah. And we can't pick it apart. We can't break it apart into its smaller bits, because there is no smaller bit. It's somehow a larger, or
Well, here's another one for you. Like Wolfgang Smith says, the scientists will say to you that red rose is not actually red, that it's just reflecting a certain light.
Yes.
Right. And so, and that
it's everything except red.
When that reflection is hitting your eye, you can break it up and you can measure what that reflection is doing inside your eye. And it's just creating this, it's going back into the cones and blah, blah, blah. And that's where red comes from. But he says, no, that rose actually is red, because the measurement cannot measure what that color looks like. The quality of red that we see is not measurable.
Yeah.
And that quality is there in that rose. It's not inside my head, because we can all see that same quality. And this is so true in terms of differences in color. Because I'm a painter.
Yeah.
And there are certain blues that I just love. There's a quality of blue. But when you try to paint that blue using paint, you can never capture it, because that blue is actually made up of multiple other blues that are shimmering together with each other. All these little dots of blue that are just slightly, some warmer, some cooler, some darker, some lighter, and they're all shimmering together. And then it makes this blue that's such a perfect blue. But it's not at all as simple as the scientists would make it up. And it's not just inside my head either. There is that, I can make that blue happen in paint, but it requires a lot of effort and quality testing and everything else, right?
Have you heard of Schwaller de Lubitz?
No.
He's a Egyptologist. I forget how to spell it right now. Schwaller de Lubitz.
I'll find it.
But yeah, and so the reason I am asking you is because he and in his school tried to reproduce the blue of the Chart glass, the Chart blue in the glass, because that's a famous example of no one since then can make the same blue. Something was lost. The technique was lost, and this is a thing that has been talked about for hundreds of years, literally. And Schwaller de Lubitz, from his multiple studies, was found out, or whatever, that it has to do with who's making the glass. That element has to be right. And he couldn't describe the methods, he said, because they're secret, or because they wouldn't make sense to someone who didn't know what to do. But he and his buddies were able to reproduce it because, I'm just trying to repeat what he wrote, that you have to make a certain internal effort while you are making the glass. while you're putting in the pigments and while you're melting the glass, et cetera, that the glass maker has to know what to do inside of him or herself, because there's some kind of a resonance or something, you know, something gets transmitted from you to the glass. So it's, yeah. So in that sense, it's not a pigment. It's not a material thing. And yet, when you look at the blue from Sharp, you know, everyone knows it who's studied that whole history of glassmaking.
Wow, that's so great.
And
I love that.
You must have had some experiences in painting, know that sometimes there's something different about you while you are painting, and then you will come back a day or a month later and you'll look at that and you'll be like, yeah, that's something right there. It's somehow on the canvas now.
Yes, and it, for me, it's one of the very most frustrating things about painting, because I want to be able to reproduce that, but I can't get back to that space that I was in that produced that in the first place. So for me, every painting is different. You know, they always say, if you want to get into a gallery, you have to have a series of paintings that are all the same hand, so that the gallery owner, if they sell one of your paintings, somebody can come in and look at the next one and they say, oh, that's another Karen Wong.
Right.
It's different, but it's the same.
Yeah.
But every painting of mine is different, because
Wow.
I'm in a different headspace every time I paint a painting, and they never are the same style. Even though many times I've tried to go back and recreate that style, I can't do it. So yeah, there's something that happens. And sometimes it's like, yes, that's the style I want to do for the rest of my life. I love that, but I can't get back there.
Getting back to where we started with nuclear transmutations, there is reasonable evidence. There really is reasonable evidence out there in the literature, and I know a few people where it's not that it actually depends upon who's doing the experiment, whether or not you see certain transmutations or not. And that just flies completely against the current scientific paradigm, right? If anything, the current scientific paradigm is designed to never, ever have that be true, that all we have to do is figure out what are the laws that are operating in this beaker that are completely separate from me, because I have nothing to do with it, right? I just want to know the laws. And if I do, I can always make gasoline that'll always burn in the same engine and always in the same way, whatever it is like that. And there's some evidence, I think, credible evidence that, well, you know, that's true in some realms, but it's not necessarily true always everywhere. That what the results of an experiment might sometimes actually depend upon who's doing the experiment, and not what they're doing, but who they are. You know,
well, that would certainly fit in with, I have not read Jung myself, but only what Jordan Peterson has said about Jung. But Jung did a lot of research into the alchemy and the history of alchemical work. And his theory was that modern science actually grew out of the alchemical work of the alchemists, who were trying to find basically the holy grail of producing, not just producing gold through transmutation, but they were seeking the higher power through the work that they were doing, right? And so they definitely thought that it had something to do with the way that they approached it, because because the best alchemists were the ones that were becoming transformed themselves to be better people, right? And to be more refined in their seeking of Christ, and trying more and more to draw close to him in the work that they did. So that would obviously affect the results of what they were finding. And then out of that came this whole realm of science, which is very, in some ways, extremely wonderful, because it's so focused on finding truth and acknowledging that truth is so far above and beyond where we're at that you can never actually find it. You can only find approximations of it. that keep getting refined. And that's the whole scientific process, is refining these approximations of truth through empirical means. But somehow we've kind of lost the through empirical means in the last 50 years. It's much more now, well, the science is settled. You know?
Yeah, that's another thing that's like, wow, do you not know the history of science? That you would actually say something like that? You know, I studied Robert Boyle quite a bit. He's a scientist that was working in the early 1600s, and he was pursuing questions like this, as was Isaac Newton, who's a little later. Most people know that now, that Isaac Newton spent a little bit of time researching physics, and then he spent a lot of time researching religion and alchemy, right? Mm-hmm. He spent a little time researching physics. And it seemed, from what I could find, Robert Boyle, and there was plenty of other people, names that we've all heard, I've forgotten most of them now, but they were not just physicists, they were architects and playwrights and religious, and they were just all from all walks of life. But something united them, and they called their organization the Invisible College. Was the name of their group. And I think there were several plays on words in that. One of them, I think, is that they were pretty private. They didn't really, you couldn't join, right? You, I guess, had to be invited or something, and you didn't really talk about everything that was going on. But also, they were the first to be studying invisible things. So Robert Boyle, what are some of the other names here? Anyway, they'll come back to me. Were like the first ones to apply the microscope. So the microscope was invented around then, and people were looking for the first time, looking like at water and seeing all these living creatures in water, right? So those were invisible before, and now they're becoming visible. And then it looked to me, from my studying of it, that they became so successful, and then the British government stepped in and said, okay, we're taking over now. Thank you for your excellent work. We're now going to we're going to create this thing called the Royal Society. And the Royal Society has been in existence since mid or late 1600s, from that transition of men and women trying to study invisible things, trying to study, as you were just saying, alchemy, but from the sense of how do I make myself better while I'm doing it, right? So they were doing all that, and then something changed, and something was definitely lost. And what went forward was the Royal Society, and it's like, we're practical. Now we're practical. Now we're going to build bridges.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which brings us right back to probably they let the Royal Society take over because that was the easier route, rather than, doing battle and standing up to it. They just
completely agree. I'm sure they just formed another invisible college.
Yeah.
Right? I hope they did. I hope they kept going. Yeah,
well, but because that's a really good word, that anytime that we kind of cave and say, okay, well, whatever, do whatever you want, and we don't state our opposition, or we don't use our votes properly, every time that happens, we have to recognize that there will be consequences. Now, the consequences may be far down the road. And certainly there were some kings in the Bible who said, well, do you want the consequences now or later? Well, give me the consequences later so that it won't be in my generation. It'll be somebody else that has to deal with it. That's what we do too. We try to push it on down the road, like our budget, our national budget right now is push it on down the road. Let our grandkids deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's pretty horrifying indictment against our personal sense of responsibility for each individual in this country.
Yeah.
Which maybe is a good place to end, because we've been going for about an hour and a half. And
okay, yeah, that would be a good place. Yeah. Yeah.
This has been a delight, Michael. I hope you can come back again sometime, because I really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, I agree on both points. Yeah, I'm sure we can do something maybe in the fall or winter. That would be great.
Okay.
And hopefully I'll have some excellent news about Orion Limited.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
that'd be exciting. Keep me
that'd be fun.
updated.
Yeah, I could come on and talk about that. Hopefully
Yeah.
that'll be good.
Okay, thank you so much. Have a
You are
great
so
day.
welcome. Okay, yeah,
Okay.
bye.
Bye-bye.